Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at aviation human factors.
Ooh,
And I know what you're
that's a tongue
thinking.
twister.
Human factors, is this just for pilots? But trust me, this goes way beyond just knowing how to fly a plane. We're going to be unlocking some incredible insights from an actual pilot training manual
Oh, wow.
about how our senses can actually deceive us up in the air, and why even experienced pilots experience these crazy illusions that can make things pretty hairy up there.
You hit the nail on the head. What's so fascinating about aviation safety is how much of it hinges on understanding the human brain, just as much as understanding the plane itself.
Right, and the stats back that up. Human error plays a role in a whopping 80% of aviation accidents.
That's a lot.
Back in the early days of flight, mechanical problems were the big, scary monster. But as planes became more and more reliable, the focus shifted to the person in the cockpit.
Exactly. And this shift really highlights how crucial it is to understand this interplay between our human perception and this high-stress environment of flight. It's like, how do our brains react when the pressure's on at 30,000 feet? And, these same principles apply to any field where making the right call under pressure is everything, not just aviation.
Right. Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. The manual dives deep into how pilots stay oriented in the air.
Okay.
It's all about knowing where you are in space, right?
Right.
It seems simple enough on the ground.
Right.
But up in the air, it relies on three systems, all working together: your eyes, the visual system, your inner ear, the vestibular system, and then your sense of touch and body position, the postural system.
You got it. And those systems generally work in perfect harmony. But the thing about flight is, it throws some pretty unique challenges into the mix. You've got these high speeds, the force of gravity pushing and pulling on you, sometimes very limited visibility, and suddenly that harmony can get a little out of tune.
Okay, first up, our eyes, the visual system. Seems pretty straightforward, right? But you'd be surprised how easily our eyes can be tricked.
Absolutely, especially when we're soaring through the air. And the manual doesn't shy away from some of these key limitations of our vision.
Okay.
We're talking about the differences between how we see during the day versus at night, blind spots that we all have, the impact of altitude on our vision, even things like whether you're a smoker or have had a drink or two.
Oh, wow. I hadn't thought about those factors. I mean, everyone knows not to drink and fly.
Right.
But the impact of smoking at high altitudes, that's something I never considered.
It's all connected. Pilots need to be incredibly aware of those limitations because they can have huge consequences. The manual also talks about how our brains process color and shapes based on what's around them. And sometimes that can lead to some wild misinterpretations.
Okay, that sounds a little abstract. Can you give me a visual?
They actually use some pretty cool visuals to help explain this. One that really stands out is a picture of a Rubik's Cube.
But here's the catch. The square that we see as orange is actually brown.
Wait, what? No way. How can an orange square actually be brown?
It all comes down to how our brains perceive color based on the surrounding shades. When you isolate that orange square, it's brown as can be. But within the context of the whole cube, our brain says, nope, that's orange.
It's like our eyes are playing tricks on us. I'm starting to see where those illusions could be a real problem.
Exactly, especially for pilots. And the manual gives another great example. It's called Shepherd's tables, an illustration with two tables that look completely different in length. But get this, they're actually identical. It's all about how our brains are processing what we see.
So what does this mean for someone who's actually flying a plane?
Well, these examples really show how our visual perception can be totally distorted, especially during flight. Imagine trying to judge the distance between your plane and the ground, or the terrain below you, when your brain is constantly trying to make sense of these misleading visual cues.
It's like your brain's trying to be helpful, but it ends up making things more confusing.
Exactly. And that's why pilots rely so heavily on their instruments, especially when visibility is low. They can't just trust what they see out the window.
Okay, so we've covered the eyes. What about the vestibular system? What is that exactly?
The vestibular system, your inner ear. This is all about balance and knowing where you are in space. The real workhorses here are the semicircular canals and the otolith organs.
Could break that down for me. What do those parts of the ear actually do?
So the semicircular canals are like your body's built-in gyroscope. They detect angular acceleration, which is basically that feeling of turning. They're filled with fluid. And when you move your head, that fluid sloshes around, bending tiny hair cells that send signals to your brain, telling you which way you're turning.
So it's like a high-tech level inner ears. What about the otolith organs?
The otolith organs are responsible for sensing linear acceleration and gravity. They use tiny crystals to actually detect movement. And they're what gives you that sensation of going up or down in an elevator or a plane taking off.
Got it. So semicircular canals handle turning. Otolith organs handle linear movement and gravity. But what does this all have to do with those crazy illusions in flight?
Here's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
You see, during a long, steady turn, the fluid in your semicircular canals actually stabilizes, which creates this weird sensation of not turning, even though the plane is still banking.
Wait, so your brain's telling you you're flying straight, even though you're in a turn. That sounds incredibly dangerous.
You're right to be concerned. This false perception is actually at the heart of some dangerous illusions that pilots are trained to recognize and overcome.
Okay, now I'm really curious about those illusions, but before we get to those, what about the third system, the postural system?
Right, the postural system. It relies on nerve signals from your skin, your muscles, and your joints to give you a sense of your body's position.
Okay, I get that. But why is that a problem when you're flying?
Think about those G-forces that pilots experience during those high-speed maneuvers. Those forces can overpower the signals from your postural system, making it super unreliable. It's like your internal GPS is suddenly getting all these weird conflicting signals. Pilots can't simply rely on that seat-of-the-pants feeling to tell them what the plane is doing.
So it's like flying blindfolded.
In a way, yes. And that's why pilots are trained to really depend on their instruments, especially when conditions are tough. They have to learn to override those natural instincts and trust the instruments, even if it feels counterintuitive.
All right, so we've got our sensory systems down, visual, vestibular, and postural, all working together to keep us oriented. But like we've learned, flight throws all these curveballs at those systems, those illusions, and that can lead to some really dangerous situations.
Exactly. And now that we have a good grasp of how these systems work, let's dive into some of the specific illusions that can occur during flight.
Bring on the illusions. I'm ready to see how our brains can trick us in the air.
Well, you're in for a treat. Some of these sound like they're straight out of a sci-fi movie.
Can't wait. What's first?
Let's start with those vestibular illusions, the ones related to your inner ear. There's one called the leans.
The leans, huh? Okay, what happens there?
Imagine a pilot is making a slow, gentle bank to the left. If they correct this bank too abruptly, it can create the illusion of leaning in the opposite direction, even though the plane is level.
It's like your brain is trying to catch up.
Yeah.
And overcompensates.
Precisely. And this false sensation can be so strong that the pilot might instinctively try to re-enter the bank, which obviously isn't a good thing when you're trying to fly straight.
Yikes, that's scary. What other vestibular illusions do we need to know about?
Well, there's one called the Coriolis illusion, which can happen during a prolonged turn. Let's say the pilot moves their head, just to glance at something on the instrument panel. That simple movement can send the fluid in the inner ear swirling, creating the feeling of the plane rotating on a totally different axis.
Hold on. So just moving your head can cause a false sense of the plane rotating. That sounds incredibly disorienting.
It is, and in this situation, a pilot might react to this false sensation by making control inputs that actually put the plane into a dangerous position.
Wow, I'm starting to see how these illusions can be so dangerous. They mess with your instincts and can lead to some really bad decisions.
Exactly. Which is why understanding these illusions and learning how to overcome them is so critical for pilots.
Okay, we've got the leans and the Coriolis illusion. What other vestibular tricks does our inner ear have up its sleeve?
There's one that's particularly notorious. They call it the graveyard spiral.
Uh-oh, that name doesn't sound good at all. What happens in a graveyard spiral?
Remember how we talked about the fluid in your semicircular canals stabilizing during a prolonged turn? Now imagine a pilot is making that turn and gradually losing altitude. Because that fluid is stabilized, they might not even realize they're turning. It creates this illusion of being in a straight descent.
So they think they're flying straight, but they're actually spiraling down. Oh man, that's terrifying.
And what's even worse is that if they try to correct this perceived descent by pulling back on the controls, they'll actually tighten the spiral, making the situation even worse.
It's like a recipe for disaster. I can see how this one earned its name.
It has, unfortunately. This illusion has contributed to a number of fatal accidents throughout aviation history.
Okay. I'm really starting to understand why pilots need to be so aware of these vestibular illusions. They can be incredibly subtle and incredibly dangerous. Are there any more?
There are a couple more worth mentioning. The cinematographic illusion and the inversion illusion.
Okay, lay those on me. What are those all about?
The symmetrographic illusion happens during rapid acceleration, like when you're taking off. That sudden surge forward stimulates the otolith organs in a way that mimics tilting your head backward. This creates the illusion that you're in a nose-up attitude, even though the plane is climbing normally.
So it feels like you're pointed straight up at the sky, even though you're not.
Exactly. And this can lead a pilot to instinctively push the nose of the plane down, potentially putting the aircraft into a dangerous situation.
That's counterintuitive. You'd think that rapid acceleration would make you feel like you're pushed back in your seat, not like you're tilting backward.
It's one of those weird quirks about how our sensory systems react in these unusual environments. And it really highlights why pilots need to trust those instruments and not just go with their gut feelings.
Okay, so we've got the leans, the Coriolis illusion, the graveyard spiral, and the somatographic illusion. Are there any more vestibular illusions we need to worry about?
Just one more. The inversion illusion. It happens when you quickly transition from a climb to level flight. That sudden change in acceleration can make you feel like you're tumbling backward.
Whoa, tumbling backward. That sounds absolutely terrifying.
It can be quite a shock, for sure. A pilot's natural reaction to this illusion might be to push the plane's nose down, which could actually intensify that tumbling sensation.
So it's a vicious cycle. Okay, so we've covered a whole bunch of ways our inner ear can trick us in flight. But what about visual illusions? Those seem even more prevalent, especially considering how much pilots rely on their eyes to fly.
You're absolutely right. The manual goes into a lot of detail about some visual illusions that can be just as dangerous as those vestibular ones.
I'm all ears. Let's hear about these visual tricks.
One that's particularly tricky is the false horizon illusion.
Okay, false horizon, that already sounds ominous. What's going on there?
Imagine you're flying at night or in weather with limited visibility. Things like sloping cloud formations, an obscured horizon. Even ground lights can be mistaken for the actual horizon.
So you think you're flying level, but you could be banking or even tilted.
Exactly. And if a pilot relies on that false visual cue, they could unknowingly put the plane into a really dangerous attitude.
It's like a mirage in the sky leading you astray.
That's a great way to put it. And it really highlights that importance of checking your instruments and not relying solely on what you see.
Okay, so false horizon is definitely one to watch out for. What other visual illusions do pilots need to be aware of?
There's one called autokinesis, and it's a strange one.
Autokinesis. Intriguing. Tell me more.
This illusion happens when you stare at a single stationary light in the darkness for a while. After a bit, that light can actually start to appear to move, even though it's completely still.
Wait, a stationary light starts to move? How is that even possible?
It's a weird phenomenon, but it's thought to be related to how our eyes are constantly making these tiny little movements, even when we're trying to focus on a single point. In the darkness, with no other visual cues to reference, those tiny movements can trick our brains into seeing motion where there is none.
So it's like our eyes are creating their own entertainment out there in the darkness.
In a way, yes. But for pilots, this can be a real problem. Imagine mistaking a stationary light for a moving target and trying to adjust your course to follow it. You could end up flying off course or even into a dangerous situation.
That's wild. So not only do we have to worry about our inner ear playing tricks on us, but now our eyes are getting in on the action too.
It's a constant battle against our own senses when it comes to flight. But luckily, pilots go through really rigorous training to learn how to recognize and overcome these illusions using their instruments and their knowledge of how these illusions work.
Well, that does make me feel a little better. But before we get into how pilots cope with all these illusions, let's dive into some specific optical illusions that can happen during landing.
You got it. This is where things get really interesting, because pilots have to switch from relying on their instruments to relying on their visual cues during landing, which can be really tricky when those visual cues are distorted.
Okay, so what kind of optical illusions are we talking about here?
One common one is the runway width illusion, which occurs when landing on a runway that's narrower or wider than what the pilot is used to.
Interesting. So how does runway width mess with your perception?
A narrower runway can create the illusion that you're higher than you actually are, leading you to make a lower approach.
That sounds incredibly dangerous. So you could end up coming in too low and hitting obstacles on the approach, or even landing short of the runway.
Exactly. Wider runways, on the other hand, can have the opposite effect, making you think you're lower than you are. This can lead to a higher approach and a harder landing.
Wow, it's fascinating how our brains try to make sense of all that visual information. but sometimes those interpretations can be way off.
Absolutely. And when you're landing a plane, even a small miscalculation can have major consequences.
Okay, runway width is one factor. What other visual cues can play tricks on pilots during landing?
There's the runway and terrain slopes illusion, which is similar to the runway width illusion, but focuses on the slope of the runway itself or the surrounding terrain.
So an uphill runway or terrain
Well,
would make you think you're higher, and a downhill runway or terrain would make you think you're lower.
exactly. And just like with the runway width illusion, this can lead to some pretty dicey approaches if the pilot isn't aware of the potential for misjudging their altitude.
It's like our brains are constantly trying to create a reference point, but those reference points can be totally misleading if we're not careful.
That's a great way to put it. And these illusions really highlight why pilots need to be extra careful when landing at airports they're not familiar with, or in challenging weather conditions, where the visual cues aren't so reliable.
Okay, we've got runway width illusion and runway and terrain slopes illusion. Are there any other landing-specific illusions we should be aware of?
There's one called the featureless terrain illusion, sometimes called the black hole approach.
Black hole approach. Okay, now I'm really intrigued. What's that all about?
This illusion happens when you're approaching over water or snow-covered landscape, places where there aren't many visual cues to help you judge your altitude,
So it's like flying into a void.
essentially. And because there are no distinct features to reference, pilots can misjudge their height, thinking they're higher than they actually are.
So they could end up making a much lower approach than they intended, which could be disastrous.
Exactly. This illusion really emphasizes the importance of relying on those instruments, especially when those visual cues are so limited or just not reliable.
Okay, so we've got runway width, terrain slopes, and featureless terrain all contributing to these potential illusions. What other visual traps do pilots need to be aware of during landing?
The manual mentions a few other factors that could distort depth perception and make you feel like you're at a different altitude than you really are.
I'm on all ears.
Things like water refraction, haze, and fog can really play tricks on your eyes, making it hard to judge distances and heights.
So it's like those mirages you see on a hot road, but in the air?
Exactly. Water refraction, especially when you've got rain on the windshield, can make the horizon appear lower than it really is, creating the illusion that you're higher than you actually are.
And that would lead to a lower approach, right?
Precisely. Haze can also be tricky because it makes things appear further away than they are, which can cause you to misjudge your distance from the runway.
And fog. Well, that just reduces visibility overall, making it harder to see anything clearly, let alone judge distances accurately.
You got it. And then there are ground lighting illusions, where pilots might mistake ground lights for runway lights, or be tricked by the brightness of runway lights into thinking they're closer to the runway than they really are.
So many ways our eyes can be tricked. It's incredible that pilots can land safely at all, with all these illusions to deal with.
It really is a testament to their skill and training.
Mm-hmm.
They have to be constantly aware of these potential illusions and be able to rely on their instruments and their knowledge to make the right calls, even when their senses are telling them otherwise.
Well, that's a perfect lead into our next topic. How do pilots handle this spatial disorientation? It sounds like a constant battle against their own senses.
You're absolutely right. Spatial disorientation is a major challenge in aviation, and pilots go through extensive training to learn how to recognize and reduce those risks.
Okay, so let's break this down. What are some of the strategies pilots use to keep these illusions from leading to disaster?
The manual really emphasizes this multi-pronged approach, but the most important thing is understanding what causes these illusions in the first place. And being on high alert for them, pilots are trained to recognize the conditions that are most likely to trigger these illusions, so they know when to be extra cautious.
So knowledge is power. The more you know about these illusions, the better equipped you are to avoid them.
Exactly. And a lot of that knowledge comes from experience. Pilots go through simulations and training exercises that are designed to induce these illusions in a safe, controlled environment.
So they can experience what these illusions feel like and learn how to react appropriately without any real danger.
Right. This kind of training really helps them build confidence and that ability to override those natural instincts when they need to.
Okay, so understanding the causes and experiencing them in a safe environment is crucial. What other strategies are there?
Another really important strategy is getting thorough weather briefings. And then to avoid flying in bad conditions unless you're really proficient in instrument flight.
So knowing what you're getting into and not pushing your limits.
Absolutely. And for those pilots who do fly in low visibility conditions or at night, Being really skilled at instrument flying is absolutely essential.
It makes sense. If you can't trust your senses, you have to be able to rely on your instruments.
Exactly. And that leads us to another key strategy, trusting those instruments, even when they seem to be contradicting what your senses are telling you.
It's like a mental discipline, overriding those powerful sensory signals and relying on the objective data from the instruments.
You nailed it. It's not easy, but it's a must-do for safe flight.
Okay. Understanding the illusions, being prepared for the conditions, and trusting the instruments are all critical. What else can pilots do to manage that risk of spatial disorientation?
While staying physically fit is really important. Fatigue, being sick, even things like medications or alcohol can make those effects of spatial disorientation so much worse. Pilots need to be in top shape, both physically and mentally, to perform at their best.
So it's not just about the technical skill, but overall well-being.
Absolutely. Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of aviation human factors.
We've covered a lot of ground so far.
We have. We've talked about how our senses work or don't work up in the air.
Great.
And those crazy illusions that can pop up when you're flying.
Yeah, and we started to touch on some of the techniques pilots use to deal with spatial disorientation.
Yeah.
But it sounds like there's another piece to this puzzle.
There is.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Well, remember at the beginning of our deep dive,
Mm-hmm.
when we mentioned that human factors play a role in over 80% of aviation accidents.
Yeah, that number really stuck with me.
It's pretty powerful, right?
It is, and it really highlights how crucial this stuff is, even for someone who, never plans to step foot in a cockpit.
Yeah, it's not just about pilots making individual mistakes. It's really about understanding the bigger picture of how humans perform in these complex systems.
Okay, that's interesting.
Think about all the different things that can affect a pilot's decisions.
Okay.
Fatigue, stress, how much workload they have, communication, even things like how the cockpit is designed and the automation that's used.
So it's not just about the pilot themselves, but the whole environment they're operating in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Aviation human factors takes this big picture view, recognizing that what we might call human error is often a symptom of a deeper issue within the system itself.
That makes a lot of sense.
Like, if there's a car accident,
Right.
it's not always the driver's fault. Sometimes it could be bad road design or faulty traffic signals or a problem with the car itself.
Right, a systemic issue.
Exactly.
Okay, so how does aviation human factors tackle those systemic issues?
Well, one of the key areas is something called crew resource management, CRM for short.
CRM. Okay, tell me about it.
CRM is all about making sure there's effective teamwork and communication happening in the cockpit.
Okay.
Recognizing that everyone on that flight crew has a part to play in keeping that flight safe.
So it's not just a captain's orders kind of situation.
Yeah.
It's more about making sure there's an environment where everyone feels comfortable
You're right.
sharing their observations, speaking up if they see something.
That's exactly it. CRM training teaches pilots how to communicate really effectively, how to handle disagreements productively, and how to support each other, especially when things get stressful.
That sounds so valuable, especially in those high-pressure situations
Right.
where, clear communication can be the difference between a safe landing and a potential disaster.
Absolutely. And what's so cool about CRM is that it really goes way beyond aviation.
Yeah.
Super relevant in any field where teamwork and communication are essential.
Like healthcare, emergency response, even in business settings. It's that idea that we all make mistakes. But if we can work together and communicate well, we can catch those mistakes before they become problems.
Precisely. Another area where aviation human factors has really made a difference is in the way cockpits are designed.
Okay, design. I can see where that would be important.
Think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Pilots are constantly getting information from all these different sources.
Okay.
Instruments, displays, controls, communications coming in.
It's a lot.
If that cockpit isn't designed in a way that makes sense, that's easy to use. It can really overload the pilots, making it harder to process all that information and make those good decisions.
So it's like trying to read a map while driving and have a conversation and try to figure out where your turn is all at the same time.
We got it. Information overload.
Right.
Experts in aviation human factors work with engineers who are designing those cockpits to try to minimize those distractions, make sure the most important information is easy to find, and that it's simple for pilots to interact with all these complex systems.
So even little things like labels that are clear, a layout that makes sense, the way the controls feel, all of that stuff can have an impact on how well a pilot can do their job.
Exactly. And it goes even beyond that. They think about the lighting in the cockpit, how comfortable it is for the pilots to sit for these long periods, even the colors that are used, all about reducing fatigue and helping pilots stay aware of what's going on around them.
It's incredible how much thought and consideration goes into every little detail of a cockpit.
Yeah, it really is.
It's like designing a workspace for someone who has to juggle like a million things at once.
That's a great way to put it. And, those same design principles have actually been adopted in other industries, too.
Really?
From car dashboards to the control rooms at nuclear power plants.
So it's like those lessons learned from aviation human factors are actually making things safer and more efficient in all kinds of systems.
Exactly.
Okay.
Another area that's getting a lot of attention these days is automation.
Automation. I can see how that could be good and bad. It could make things easier for pilots, take over some of those tasks.
Mm-hmm.
But it could also lead to them not paying as much attention or losing some of their skills.
You're exactly right. Automation is incredibly powerful, but it really has to be implemented carefully and thoughtfully, always keeping that human factor in mind.
So how do you strike that right balance?
Aviation Place, human factors experts are focused on designing automation systems that work alongside human skills, not as replacements for them.
Okay, so maybe letting automation take care of those routine tasks, but leaving that critical decision-making up to the pilots.
That's the idea. And it's also about making sure that pilots really understand how the automation works, what its limitations are, and how to take control back from that system if they need to.
So it's like a partnership between humans and technology, not just handing over the control to the machines.
Exactly. And this human-centered approach to automation is going to become even more important as the technology keeps getting more and more advanced.
Makes a lot of sense. Even with all this really cool technology we have these days, there's still no substitute for human judgment and oversight.
Absolutely. And what's so great about aviation human factors is it provides this framework for understanding that balance between human capabilities and these amazing technological advancements.
This has been such an eye-opening dive into aviation human factors. We started by talking about those limitations of our senses, those illusions that can trick us up in the air, and now we've learned all about how human performance fits into these really complex systems.
It's been great.
Yeah, it has.
And it's not just about aviation. It's about making things safer and more efficient in all sorts of areas of life.
It's amazing how much we can learn from a field that seems so specialized.
Right.
But it really highlights that even in the most technical fields, it's always about the people involved.
I couldn't agree more. We can't forget about that human element, especially as technology continues to push the boundaries of what's possible.
Well said. Well, I'm excited to keep this dive going. I'm sure there are even more insights waiting for us.
There are. When we come back, we'll wrap things up with some final thoughts about what we've learned. And leave our listeners with something to think about.
Okay, sounds good. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into aviation human factors. We've covered a lot of ground, from those weird sensory illusions to how pilots handle spatial disorientation.
Yeah, and how human performance fits into these complex systems.
Right, thinking about CRM, cockpit design.
It's all about understanding that human element in aviation.
Right, and beyond.
Yeah.
It's been a real eye-opener for me. I feel like I've gained a whole new level of respect for what pilots do, facing all those challenges every time they fly.
And remember, those challenges aren't limited to aviation. The things we've learned about human perception, how we make decisions under pressure, the importance of designing systems that work for humans, those apply to so many other fields as well.
Absolutely. Healthcare, transportation, even just our everyday lives. Understanding how our brains work and building systems that support us rather than trip us up is so important.
One thing that's really stuck with me throughout this whole deep dive is how often our intuition can lead us down the wrong path.
It's true.
It's like those gut feelings are always the best guide.
It's so true. I mean, we talked about all those visual and vestibular illusions where what seems so obvious to our senses is actually completely wrong.
Exactly. It really highlights that we can't always trust our gut.
Yeah.
Especially in those situations that are complex, high stress, or just unfamiliar.
So if we can't always rely on our intuition, what's the solution? How do we avoid falling into those traps?
Well, as we've seen in aviation, it's all about developing that healthy sense of skepticism towards our own perceptions. We need to look for that objective data, challenge our assumptions, be willing to admit when we might be wrong.
It's like applying the scientific method to everyday life. Observe, question, test, and don't be afraid to adjust your course if the data tells you to.
That's a great way to put it. And that mindset's not just for pilots. It's so valuable for anyone. Who wants to make better decisions and avoid those costly mistakes?
It's about recognizing that we all have biases, those blind spots in our thinking, and just being aware of those biases can help us, minimize their influence.
You got it. And that awareness is so important, especially in today's world where we're bombarded with information. It's easy to get caught up in the hype or to follow the crowd, but we need to be critical thinkers, really evaluating the information we're getting and basing our decisions on evidence, not just emotions.
Well said. I think that leads us to a really interesting question for our listeners today.
I agree.
We've spent this episode focusing on how understanding those challenges specific to aviation can lead to greater safety in the air. But what if we took that same kind of thinking and applied it to other parts of our lives?
I like where you're going with this. Give me an example.
Okay, let's think about those optical illusions that we discussed.
Okay.
They show just how easily our brains can be tricked by what we see,
Right.
leading us to, misjudge distances, speeds, the size of objects.
Like that runway with illusion, where a narrower runway can make you think you're higher up than you actually are.
Exactly. Now, what if we took that concept and applied it to, how we make decisions in our everyday life?
Right.
Are there situations where we might be misjudging the runway, so to speak, and making choices that aren't actually in our best interest?
That's a fantastic question. It really makes you think about all those subtle biases and mental shortcuts we use to navigate the world. And sometimes, those shortcuts can lead us astray.
Exactly. And if we can become more aware of those potential pitfalls, we can be more intentional about our decisions, less likely to, act impulsively or fall prey to those cognitive biases.
It's like taking the lessons from aviation human factors and applying them to our own personal cockpits.
That's a perfect way to put it. It's a reminder that we're all pilots, in a sense, navigating the complexities of life. And by understanding these principles of human performance, we can all learn to fly a little safer, a little smarter, and maybe even enjoy the journey a little bit more.
That's fantastic. I love that.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. But this has been such an incredible deep dive into aviation human factors.
It has.
We've learned so much about how our brains work, how they can be tricked, and how to create systems that really support us.
And hopefully, our listeners have gained some valuable insights as well, whether they're up in the air or right here on the ground.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next time for another exciting exploration of the world around us.
Until then, keep questioning your assumptions and never stop learning. Fly safe, everyone,